The Funhouse, Tobe Hooper's somewhat forgotten but still cult film from the early 80s. And the movie that inspired the recent, arguably more significant cult film Haunt, from the guys who wrote A Quiet Place that came out last year. Let's talk about it.
Who is mad enough to enter that world of darkness?
Something is alive in the funhouse. Something not alive like its father. Something better dead.
So The Funhouse is a notable movie mostly for what it represents in Tobe Hooper's career. Now, Tobe Hooper, who had directed the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, of course, which was a massive success, but a major independent film. It was made out way outside of Hollywood. It was made in Texas. It was a local production, essentially. He followed that up with Eaten Alive, which was obviously a bigger budget. It had some kind of name actors behind it, but it still wasn't really it was still an indie. It was still not a major thing. It was a drive-in movie. That's how it was made. That's how it was marketed. That's how it was distributed. It was a drive-in movie. It wasn't a big film. It wasn't a studio film by any stretch of the imagination. The Funhouse is. The Funhouse was a Universal Pictures film. So it was kind of the movie that opened the door, just a crack for Tobe Hooper. See, this movie was made just as the slasher boom was getting off the ground, and studios were just hungry for these things because the profit margins were just insane on them. Following Halloween and Friday the 13th, every studio wanted to be in the slasher business. Now, whether you were going to do a straightforward slasher or you were going to kind of try and do like a slasher but not, and that would be the difference between, say a Slumber Party Massacre versus a 10 to Midnight, I believe was the name of that Charles Bronson slasher movie. But yeah, so The Funhouse was Hooper's first studio production. He was actually really glad to have it, even though the script isn't great. The script isn't great, but he was glad to have. He was glad to have the money and the production values. And one thing he particularly enjoyed working at Universal Pictures was that he got to include Universal monsters. You see very clearly Boris Karloff's Frankenstein's monster is prominently featured in this movie. It's very important, and also in the boys' room at the beginning of the movie. It also has several other Universal's classic monsters. The Wolfman, I think you also see Dracula in there. And of course, the Frankenstein's monster mask plays very prominently into this movie. So it's cool because, Hooper, given his age, he had to have grown up on Universal Pictures horror films. They were the horror movies of the time. They were colossal. Frankenstein, Dracula, the Mummy, the Wolfman, the Creature from the Black Lagoon. These things were massive, and they were, if you were into horror at that time period, you saw those movies, period. So that was kind of cool for him, and but beyond that, it was just the studio wanted a slasher movie, so they got a guy with a proven track record in horror. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre was a massive financial success. So Hooper got this job, and he just kind of did it the best that it could be done. So The Funhouse was kind of a minor hit at the time it was released. It didn't blow up. It wasn't huge. It was just a financially successful slasher, and given its budget, it almost would have had to work not to be financially successful, but it was still well received-ish. The fact that it's relatively tame, actually, compared to other slashers in terms of gore and sex, also helped because critics gave it a bit more of a pass than they would have some other movies. Critics at the time were very moralistic. They were very up in arms about the slasher films, and what they saw was just grotesque, sleazy movies. So that, this isn't the New York Ripper by any stretch of the imagination. The violence is pretty tame. The sex, there's a little bit, but not much. So Hooper clearly was kind of playing with the slasher tropes right from the beginning, which, the beginning feels like it's lifted straight out of John Carpenter's Halloween, with this long POV shot of a killer putting on a mask, grabbing a knife, and stalking a pretty naked girl in the bathtub, as opposed to in front of her mirror like in Halloween. I'm just saying, it's obvious that it's the exact same thing, only this is a prank. That's a, at this time, that was a fun little gag. Now, that's such a cliche now that no one would really think about it. But at the time, that was a cool little gag. And it was a good way it was an interesting way to introduce us to our leading lady, considering she's really the only actress, she's the only nudity in the movie, and that is almost never the case in these movies. The female lead is usually the one that keeps her clothes on, but this actress, Elizabeth Berridge, who's given an introducing credit, even though she had done some stuff before this, but I think they were kind of trying to pretend they had found the next Jamie Lee Curtis, like introducing, oh yeah, she's got a couple projects already, but she was in, she's the final girl, and you can tell right from the beginning that she's the final girl. She's the one we're following. We meet her parents, who are terrible people, especially her mom. Her brother, who's kind of a brat, but for his age, I don't think it's necessarily anything too grievous. And, you know, she's going on a blind date with a guy who's in his late 20s. Hell, I think he's actually over 30. I don't remember. In the movie, they don't really address his age. It's clear that he's older than the other kids, though. And no one really seems to know him. He works at the gas station. He's just the handsome, hunky guy in the small town. So she goes on this double date with this guy and then her two friends. And they arrive at the local carnival, even though her father has specifically told her, don't come here, don't go to this thing. It's dangerous, it's not safe. There were some people killed at one of these things not too long ago. So she goes anyway, and she and her date aren't really hitting it off, but then they do hit it off. They actually have really good chemistry. Elizabeth Berridge is a very good actress. She's really one of my favorite scream queens of the 80s. I like her a lot, and I wish she'd done more genre stuff, but she really didn't. She really didn't do much else at all. Her career is kind of weird because she did this, which, you know, landing a lead this early in her career was a good. You know, it was good. It was a big studio film with a noted director. Then she did Amadeus. Now, Amadeus, as in Amadeus Mozart, was a colossal movie, huge budget, directed by an Oscar-winning director. You know, the film itself won several Academy Awards. It was this big, critically acclaimed thing. And she's the female lead in that movie. And her career went nowhere after that. I looked, I researched it. I couldn't find any particular reason why her career just did nothing after Amadeus. It's very strange. Because I really like her, and I wish that she had more of a resume, but there's just not a lot out there about her. Anyway, I like her a lot in this movie. And, you know, yeah, she is a standard final girl, but she plays the role very well and very realistically. And again, I think she and her boyfriend have this good chemistry where you kind of see them inching towards each other. Like, he'll make a joke she doesn't appreciate, and she'll pull it back a little bit. But then he'll apologize, and they'll move back towards each other, and then she'll feel a little awkward, and like when all the whole group's smoking pot, and it's clear that she's not as into it, and then she kind of edges back. They play that very well. Now, the four leads are all pretty solidly established characters. They all have a good rapport, good chemistry. They're believable together, and it works pretty well. You know, like it doesn't boil them down to just archetypes. It doesn't just say slutty girl, annoying guy, jerky jock guy. Like they all feel like fairly well-rounded, real people. So they go to the amusement park, and they do all the rides and stuff. And this stuff does kind of feel like filler, honestly. You get two noted character actors, William Finley, who played the title character in Brian De Palma's Phantom of the Paradise, the notorious horror rock opera. He does this whole bit as a alcoholic magician dressed as Dracula, and Sylvia Miles, who was actually an Oscar nominee at the time, as this phony, obvious, lame-o gypsy prostitute. So yeah, you're just kind of meandering around the park. You go to the freak show, which has some real deformities, some animal deformities. And while they go to the freak show, they see the girly show, I guess you'd call it. And what's kind of funny is that Kevin Conway, who's credited as the Barker, plays the Barker at all three major attractions you see. But weirdly, he's a different character each time, and I didn't even notice that until I just saw it pointed out in the credits. Apparently the actor just really wanted to do it, and he's really good in this movie. Actually, his performance is very good. He plays the role very straight and very real. Tobe Hooper's direction is great. You know, it's very visually compelling. He gets to work in some of that Tobe Hooper mania. So with the arguable exception of Poltergeist, which, you know, there's always that argument as to whether Steven Spielberg directed that or Tobe Hooper directed that. But except for Poltergeist, Tobe Hooper's movies always are insane. They're always over the top. They're always crazy. He always gets his actors and his visuals to a place that very few other films go. And that's what I love so much about Tobe Hooper. Yeah, and This movie, of course, was right before Poltergeist, and from there in the 80s, he had a string of major studio films, from the Funhouse to Poltergeist to the three he did for Carolco, I believe was the name of that company, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, Life Force, and Invaders from Mars. Then his career kind of slowed back down. He did a few more studio films into the mid-90s. The Mangler, the Stephen King adaptation, was really the last major studio movie he did, and then after that it was more or less back to doing independent films until the time of his death about 3 years ago. But you can't talk too much about this movie's plot, because this movie doesn't have a lot of plot. Basically, you get introduced to the four kids, they go around the amusement park, they kind of do everything there is to do, and the little brother, who pranked his sister at the beginning with the fake knife in the shower, sneaks in, and they decide they're going to spend the night in the Funhouse. The Funhouse, which is really more of a haunted house, but at that time I guess they called them Funhouses. So they do that. They decide that, and there's not really a lot of discussion as to why. The question is, how can we do this? It's not really a question of, and I guess they're really just looking for a place to have sex, which is how it plays. But it is kind of, I wouldn't really want to spend the night at this place if it was me. It just seems like you'd get bored pretty quickly. But, so they spend the night, and they witness the Barker's assistant, who is dressed as Frankenstein's monster, sort of ushering, paying the gypsy lady who they had an argument with earlier for sex. And after he prematurely ejaculates and wants his money back, she says, "No refunds, it's not my fault." So he kills her, and they see that, and he realizes that he saw it, and he tells the Barker, who turns out to be his dad. So, well, he doesn't talk because he can't talk, but the Barker figures out what happened, and he figures out that these kids are there because one of them steals the money from their little cash box that they've been making all night. So they're essentially just being hunted through the Funhouse. Like I said, not much plot. This isn't a very good script. This isn't a very ambitious script. But Hooper gets a lot of good visuals, and the villains are particularly solid. So he had one gag in this movie that he points out, where the assistant wearing the Frankenstein's monster mask is a monster wearing a monster mask. Because when he takes off that mask, it's really pretty legitimately shocking. I remember the first time I saw this as a kid. This movie was a big staple of late-night cable television. This would come on all the time, along with movies like Motel Hell or the Friday the 13th sequels. It was just on a lot in the 90s cable. So when he takes off his mask, it's not that you think he's going to look normal. It's that he looks so much more bizarre than you expect. I mean, he looks like a legit monster. This like wiry white hair, and he's got like such a bad cleft palate that he's almost got two faces. It's so bisected. He's got little sharp teeth, and he looks like a monster. He doesn't look like a human being. And because it waits long enough into it to show you that he's a monster, you really just think of him as a human. Now, you might expect him to be deformed or disfigured or ugly in some way, but you don't expect him to look like a damn bat monster. So it's a cool, legitimate shock, and the design on the face is cool and is good. It's not the best makeup in history, but it's good for its time. It's good for a lower budget, early 80s movie. So I like the vibe of this movie. This has a good, weird, off-kilter vibe. It's got good acting. It's got good production design. It's well shot. It's generally all around good except for the script, and you can't get around that. This is a movie that has a ton of setup, and then the kills are pretty weak. Because you only have 4 kids at the center of this, that really limits how many people can die, and especially given how little the younger brother ultimately plays into it. He's not the cavalry. He's not coming to save them. He just kind of sees the monster one good time, freaks out, faints, is discovered by the guy who presumably runs the carnival. They call his parents. Parents come, pick him up. Don't seem to mind that the guy who runs the carnival really, really is creepy as hell with their kid. Like, he's passed out in this guy's gypsy caravan van. And this guy is drinking around their passed out child. He's being like weirdly tender, like he strokes his cheek. It really looks like this guy might have molested this kid, and the parents could give a fuck. they're just like annoyed they had to come out in the middle of the night. They are the least bit worried about their kid. It's like, great, just grab him, shove him in the car. The kid is clearly traumatized. They don't question this. They don't wonder about it. Just like, that's a pain in the ass. I'm gonna go be home sleeping right now. So they're bad parents. So from there, it's pretty straightforward. It's a body count movie after that, and it has some good set pieces. The bit with the dead body on the tram is pretty cool. The final confrontation with the Barker is good. The one girl's death in the tunnel is just right behind me right now. That was timed out well. It's not great because most of it's off camera, but it does give you the impression that he raped her after he killed her. So that's creepy, you know. And the guy playing the monster does a great job. I don't recall his name, but his other major claim to fame as far as film goes, the guy's a mime actually, is that he was the fat clown guy at the club in Scarface. If you remember the Al Pacino Scarface movie, the big shootout at the club where they attempt to kill Tony, Pacino's character Tony Montana, in the club. There's this fat guy with a kind of a goofy clown mask on dancing around. It's not really a clown mask. It's just like a weird guy mask. He has like a big nose, and he gets shot. That's the killer from this movie. That's his other big film credit, is the mime dancer entertainer in Scarface that gets shot. He does a good job, and he does what Tobe Hooper is good at getting out of his actors. He's very manic. He's very strange. The movements are very exaggerated. He gets a good, weird, over-the-top performance out of this guy. So, and it's cool. I like it a lot. Apparently the guy who, I want to say is Kevin Yeager. I think it was Kevin Yeager, who designed the makeup effects, was originally just going to play a monster, but Tobe Hooper found a real actor to do it. And it's usually better to get a real actor than just go with the guy who's willing to wear the mask. If you get a real actor, you get a real performance. Now there are exceptions to that. Kane Hodder wasn't much of an actor when he did Jason Voorhees, and he's fantastic. But if you imagine Freddy Krueger being played by a stuntman versus Robert Englund, it's much better when you get a real actor. So with weak kills, this is a movie to watch for the visuals. It's a good, weird movie, but it's not an amazing movie by any stretch of the imagination. The guys who made Haunt have openly said that they were inspired by this movie, and given their age, they would have grown up the same way I did, with having seen this on late night TV, and it's a cool little unique weird movie. And this movie is made obviously way before this rash of extreme haunts gone wild movies. I don't know what you call them. Movies like the Funhouse Massacre, or Hell House LLC, or Haunt. Or I mean, there's been a ton of these things. Hellfest is another one. There's been a ton of these things. And Haunt is arguably the best of them. It's certainly the most respected. I actually think I preferred the original Hell House LLC a bit to it. But Haunt is a pretty solid example of it. And, it's a pretty similar premise in that one they're intentionally going to the place and they don't... It's similar. You can obviously see how this was inspired by that. Or vice versa, actually. That was inspired by this movie. But it's interesting kind of watching this. And I think that it's just kind of the middle ground in Tobe Hooper's career between when he was an indie guy and when he became a studio guy, albeit briefly. It was really only in the 80s. So it's a fun little watch for fans of the 80s, especially early 80s. It's very early 80s. It doesn't have the camp. It doesn't have the camp that kind of eked its way into slashers in the later 80s. It's very straightforward. It plays it serious, and I do actually enjoy that. I like how dark this movie feels towards the end. When people die, people are upset. There's not like these dumb jokes to kind of break the tension. It's a pretty grim movie in a lot of ways. And lastly, there's a weird kind of story about the novelization. So studio films, not so much anymore, but still sometimes. But back then, a big part of the movie's marketing was they would have someone read the screenplay and write a novel of it, and they'd sell that as a way to promote the movie. So you'd be able to buy like the little paperback, the Funhouse book, a few months before the movie came out. And the guy they hired to write it was Dean Koontz. Now Dean Koontz is a pretty well-known horror author. He was very prolific in the 90s and 2000s. He wrote Phantoms, he wrote Frenzy, he wrote... I'm actually not that big of a Dean Koontz fan, but I know he wrote a ton of stuff. So Dean Koontz was given the job of writing the novelization for the Funhouse, and he read the script, and he didn't see how you would do this. He didn't see how to turn this script into a novel. So he actually wrote what is very much a prequel. He wrote a prequel to the Funhouse. And I've read it, and it's interesting. It goes into a lot of depth about the relationship between the Barker and his son, and the murders that the son had committed in the past, which they constantly allude to here. It also establishes a lot about the four kids and their dynamic, and how the lead girl is kind of being corrupted by her two friends. Not the boyfriend, because keep in mind this is their first date, but the two friends who are, smoking pot and kind of experimenting sexually and this and that. So it did a lot of backstory stuff. And then the body of the film is all crammed into maybe the last 40 pages of the book. It's kind of insane how much he rushed through the actual movie that he was supposed to be adapting. So that was interesting. It's worth checking out. I don't know if it's particularly rare. I've had a copy for a long time, but I couldn't find it. I looked for it, and I couldn't find it. I've moved so many times since then. It's lost. But the Funhouse, a pretty solid, atmospheric 80s slasher, just not a gore fest by any stretch of the imagination. So it's a little bit light in that regard. But aside from that, it's good. And for fans of Tobe Hooper, it's interesting. It honestly is one of his better, but not one of his best movies. It's kind of like high average as far as Hooper's output goes. But you do have some great insanity, some great darkness, some great camera work. It's very much worth watching just for that. That's all I got to say.